Hello everyone and welcome back. In this episode we're gonna look at the dual socket extended ATX motherboard, then we're gonna win a round of Counter-Strike without firing a single shot, we're going to see some boring charts again, and we're going to conclude by looking at more tests. Today we're going to have a special episode looking at the Intel Xeon 3.2 GHz. Since there's no box and no way to overclock this CPU, we're going to have just one episode for this processor. And we will start with the extended ATX motherboard. This is the MSI MS-9121 and it can accommodate 2-socket 604 CPUs, but for these you will need a power supply unit with a 24-pin connector and also a 12-volt 8-pin connector. Somewhere under these radiators there's an Intel E7505 North Bridge. Unfortunately, it only has 100 or 133 MHz system clock, which means 400 or 533 frontside bus CPUs. It also restricts us to using DDR200 or 266, but we have dual channel and 4 slots. Fortunately, there's a 50-watt AGP Pro 8X slot, and I can also recognize a normal PCI slot that's similar to what we usually see with the regular motherboards. There are 4 additional PCI extended slots that can accommodate various server extension boards. These run at a higher frequency than the regular PCI and allow for faster transfer rates. There's also a mini PCI that can accommodate a special video card. I could also recognize the IDE connectors and also the floppy connector. There are also 2 SCSI connectors for faster server hard drives. I have 2 Quantum Atlas hard drives and maybe we'll get the chance to test them someday. On the back of the board there's some protective plastic, and I also had to remove some pins from the bench table as some of the mounting holes were missing. In the backplate area there are the regular mouse and keyboard PS2, there are 2 USBs, 2 serial and 1 parallel port. There's a gigabit Ethernet connector and 6-channel audio. Now let's fit the CPU. Unfortunately, this motherboard came without any mounting bracket for the CPU, so I struggled for about half a year to find one. I only managed to find one on an older socket 423 motherboard. The radiator also matched the height of the CPU, so I could start the system. Unfortunately, I only have one bracket, so benchmarking with 2 CPUs will also have to wait for another time. The CPU has thermal compound already applied to it since I removed it for filming the assembly process. Ultimately, the Corsair RAM refused to start, but fortunately the Adata we had from before started. We will continue with the assembly. This is the 24-pin connector, and we also have the 8-pin 12-volt connector. Next we're gonna add the IDE. And finally we add the graphics card. Let's have another look at it before we power it up. Now let's look at the custom BIOS. The system summary does exactly what it says. It is worth mentioning that the Xeon CPU has 1 MB of level 3 cache. System information only shows some serial numbers. Devices and input-output ports allows us to disable some unuseful devices and enable functionality like mouse and keyboard over USB. Date and time sets the date. System security allows for passwords. Start option hosts some generic options like the booting order and other settings. Advanced setup has some more settings, but I didn't hold my breath for anything too advanced. The chipset features has some of the settings we usually change, and it also shows the read-only value for the memory timings. Finally, the processor control has some more options, and we're going to leave the hyperthreading disabled. The health status offers the regular temperature and voltage readings, and the error logs show some issues the motherboard encountered during the post-operation. We're going to save and go to Windows. I may have forgotten to mention that although manufactured by MSI, this motherboard was originally used by an IBM workstation. CPU-Z shows that the CPU is on 130 nanometers, and it also runs on a 533 frontside bus. It also has 1 MB of level 3 cache, but we couldn't get a voltage reading on this one. Unfortunately, CPU-Z also couldn't read the memory timings for any slot. Although we have seen them in the BIOS, we'll go to Everest for the rest of the readings. It looks like the voltage is 1.525 volts. Also, one other interesting thing is that the level 2 cache has ECC, error correction. The modules are in dual channel and the timings are 2.5337 and are running at 266 MHz. Now let's move to the benchmarks. SuperPi is a bit of a letdown with its almost 50-second mark, but we know that the memory timings are affecting these results. In Sandra, the CPU looks really close to the Athlon XP 3200 Plus, and also in multimedia. In Cinebench, the result is pretty good, on par with the other Intel. I was very curious to run CacheMem to see the speeds of the level 3 cache. It looks no faster than the RAM. The encoding was also just as fast as the original Pentium 4. And we will continue with ViewSpec performance. Next, there are the graphics tests, and today we are only going to show parts of 3D Mark and Aquamark 3. In order to save time, we are only going to look at the results for the rest of the tests. In the background, there's the benchmark for X to the fret running on this system. And after all these tests, we're getting to the fun part. And we're starting by looking at the frame rate for a cutscene in Mafia.
At last, I could eat a horse.
Hey, Danzerieri, welcome!
Pepe, you don't even know how much I'm looking forward to your specialties. Fantastic meal, Pepe. I haven't eaten that well in a long time.
Molto grazie, Don. Praise from a gourmet like you always makes me feel with joy.
Oh, please, I'm no gourmet. If you knew what I ate for dinner yesterday, you definitely wouldn't say that.
Can I get you anything else, Adana? I have an excellent Chianti.
Really? Let's get it out here then, Pepe.
At once, sir.
How'd you like it, Tommy?
It was fantastic, boss. I'll have to bring Sarah here sometime.
Ah, yes, you certainly should, Tommy. Just be careful that Sarah doesn't take offense. She cooks worse than Pepe. What the hell is going on? This is ruining my lunch.
Well, must have nothing better to do.
They could have at least let me taste the wine, Gobbones.
Get this over with.
Throw him his present, Joe. Maybe we'll smoke him out.
Working for you is real interesting, boss.
What'd you say? My ears are ringing from that blast.
Yes, boss.
It looks like we won't get out
This
way.
was a little busy, and we only got 7 frames per second in the 0.1% low, but the average was 56. Next, let's look at the game itself. and this time it went far better with 20 frames per second in the 0.1% low, and the average of 58. The next game is Railroad Pioneer, one game I enjoyed a lot back in the day, that unfortunately had many bugs. Since this is a railroad planner, I'm going to fast forward by a factor of 3. And the frame rate wasn't encouraging, although the minimum recommended system was a 700 MHz Pentium 3. In the end, this is not as bad as the statistics show, but the game stutters a lot. Counter-Strike is next, and I was able to complete this map without firing a single bullet. I'm not reacting to teammates' audio, since the audio is connected to the capture card.
Upstairs. One guy left. Outside. Truck.
With an average of 70 frames per second and a 0.1% low of 29, this setup is more than able to handle the game. Return to Castle Wolfenstein achieves 30 frames per second in the 0.1% low, which is 8 frames per second lower than the Athlon 64 we had in the last episode. But the average is still 90. GTA Vice City constantly pulls an average of 90 frames per second, but there are some occasional loading screens that bring the 0.1% low in the 20s. Without these, the 0.1% stays in the 35 to 40 frames per second.
We interrupt your programming with a message from the State Department. All bridges and some roads in the Vice City metropolitan area have been closed because of a severe weather warning. Meteorologists are tracking Hurricane Hermione, which has devastated 5 Caribbean islands and is heading for Vice City. More updates soon.
The last game today is Porsche 2000 that has an average of over 60 frames per second, with the 0.1% lows in the mid-30s. This is the first time I'm seeing the memory consumption for this game, which gives me hope that we can run this game on the really retro systems. Overall, this CPU is just as capable to run games as any other processor we had in this series. Since the first test I did was SuperPi, the start was disappointing for me. Almost hitting the 50-second mark made this the slowest CPU we had in this series. SuperPi looks dependent on the RAM frequency and timings, so I guess that played an important part here. Cinebench was marginally slower, and the encoding was just as fast as the Pentium 4. So the Xeon processor recovers in the productivity area. PC Mark also shows the CPU being in the same category as the Pentium 4. The RAM takes a hit because of the reduced frequency. Sandra shows no difference between the Pentium 4 and the Xeon processor. I'm starting to get an Athlon 64 deja vu. CPU bench shows some differences in the general score, which may be attributed to the RAM, since the arithmetic logical unit and the floating point unit are identical to those on the Pentium. Finally, we reached the long-awaited cache mem, and it looks like the Xeon has a very fast level 1 cache. Other than that, we can see for the first time the presence of the level 3 cache, which is just as fast as the RAM. Moving on to the graphics benchmarks, we can see some drops in 3D Mark that may be due to memory, but most of the other games show similar scores to the Pentium 4. Overall, I'm happy that we didn't have another situation like we did with the Athlon 64s. The Xeon is definitely a different processor from the Pentium 4, or maybe it's the same, but the memory makes it drag its feet, while the level 3 cache pushes it forward. Unlike the Athlon 64s, the scores are not similar to just 1 or 2%, but rather there's a bigger margin between the Xeon and the Pentium 4. Comparing it to the Athlon XP, I have to say that if we used the Xeon instead of the Pentium 4, it would have been more of an equal fight. Still, having SSE 2 instructions and level 3 cache memory, the Xeon is more future-proof than the Athlon. Also in the productivity area, the Xeon constantly pulls ahead, showing its true nature. I'm willing to bet that the 800 MHz frontside bus Xeon version is better than the equivalent Pentium 4 in this area. Going to the games, I could only see the Athlon losing to only a few games and having the edge over the Xeon in many others. But again, the Xeon was never built for gaming. Also, the motherboard shows nothing to support even a mild overclock to help in this area. Comparing it to the Athlon 64 is pointless, since the AMD processor has the additional SSE 3 instructions and also has support for 64-bit, making it even more future-proof than the Xeon. But it was nice getting to know this CPU and socket. The only curiosity I have left is the benchmark with two Xeon CPUs and also comparing the hyperthreading on the Xeon to that of the Pentium 4, but all these are for another clip. One last thing worth mentioning is the power consumption. While idle, it sits comfortable at 93 watts. In 3D Mark we could see a power consumption of about 164 watts, putting this CPU 20 watts over the Pentium 4 and almost doubling the feature of the Pentium M. This makes me wonder about the number for two CPUs. Since this motherboard and CPU are not going to be part of the Looking for the Ultimate AGP Motherboard series, we still can't miss the opportunity to do some random benchmarking, and we're going to run just a couple of tests with some other graphic cards that are a bit newer. Here's a generic 6800 LE that we will fit onto the system and then run 3D Mark. and we follow the GeForce 6 series with the Gainward 7900 GS. And here are the results for the tests. It's no surprise here, as the 7900 GS is faster than the 6800 LE, but I was surprised to find such a small difference in 3D Mark 2001 and Aquamark, and have more than double the difference in 3D Mark 2003 and 2005. Strictly looking at the 7900 GS, because we had it tested with the Pentium M, we can see that the overclocked Pentium M really raised the score for 3D Mark and Aquamark 3, showing that both programs are somewhat CPU dependent, while in 3D Mark 2003 and 2009 the two platforms remained fairly equal. For now, the 3200 MHz Challenge series is going to be on hold for a few months, but we will come back to it with some more workstation CPUs, some Celerons, Semprons, and even mobiles for further benchmarking. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.